I've been alive for 75 years, and I'm only now learning what it means to actually live. That sounds like something you'd read on one of those inspirational posters they hang in hospital waiting rooms, the ones with sunset photographs and quotes about second chances. I used to hate those posters. I used to think they were cheap platitudes designed to comfort people facing uncomfortable truths. But I'm sitting in my kitchen on a Tuesday morning in March, watching the light come through the window in a way that feels almost orchestrated, and I understand now that some truths are only cheap until you've lived through them yourself. My name is Robert Pattinson. Yes, that Robert Pattinson. No, not the actor, the real one, the original technically, though I was born 3 decades before he was famous. I've spent most of my life either being mistaken for him or explaining that I'm not him, which is its own kind of joke. The universe has a sense of humor about these things, I've learned. And irony, lots of irony. I'm writing this because I died, or at least I came very close to it, and the distinction between those two states is becoming increasingly blurry to me. I was pronounced dead for 4 minutes and 38 seconds on the morning of March 15, 2024. A nurse told me that number later, and I remember thinking it was oddly specific, as if those extra 8 seconds mattered, as if death was patient enough to count. But before I get to that part, the part that everyone's going to want to hear, I need to tell you about what came before. Because if I've learned anything in the months since waking up in that hospital, it's that you can't understand the ending of a story without understanding the beginning. And mine is a story about disappointment, distance, shame, and a man who taught himself to be numb to almost everything except regret. I was born in 1949 in Portland, Oregon, not the Portland of today, the artisanal coffee, the tech startups, the carefully curated indie aesthetic. I'm talking about a Portland of gray skis, shipyards, working-class families who didn't think much about their pasts or their futures because the present was exhausting enough. My father worked in construction. My mother worked in a textile factory. Neither of them had finished high school, and neither of them seemed particularly bothered by it. I was the oldest of 4 children. I had 2 brothers and a sister, all of them now scattered across the country, or in some cases, across the country and back again, via different routes, different marriages, different catastrophes. The fact that I haven't spoken to my sister in 17 years and my younger brother in 11 is not a story of dramatic betrayal. It's a story of what happens when people don't know how to be close to each other, and they pretend for a while, and then they stop pretending, and pretty soon there's nothing left to fake. I wasn't a particularly troubled child. I wasn't a particularly special one, either. I was average in my grades, adequate in my athletic abilities, invisible in most social situations. The kind of boy that teachers could barely remember after he left their classroom. The kind of boy who could sit in the same lunch table with people for an entire year and never have a single conversation that mattered. I met Margaret in the 10th grade. She was standing at her locker and someone had knocked into her and made her drop her books. I helped her pick them up. That was the entire story of how we met, not romantic, not memorable, just a small gesture that happened to occur at a moment when she needed it. She was kind to me after that, not in a way that was romantic at first, but in a way that was familiar. She was always there. For 3 years, she was the one person who seemed to understand without me having to explain anything. We got married when I was 19. She was 18. It seemed like the right thing to do at the time. It was what people did. You found someone, you were kind of comfortable with each other, and you made it official. You didn't ask yourself if you were in love or compatible or had any business committing to anything permanent. You just did it. It was 1968, and the world felt like it was ending, and getting married seemed like as good a way as any to pretend you had some control over something. My son David was born in 1970. He arrived on a Tuesday in November, and I was 20 years old and completely terrified. I remember holding him, looking down at his face and thinking, I have no idea what I'm doing. This thought was not comforting, but I learned, or at least I learned enough to keep him alive, which is apparently the bare minimum required of fathers. I had various jobs over the years. I worked in construction like my father, which made sense given my genetics and my education level. I worked in warehouses. I spent some years managing a grocery store, nothing prestigious, nothing that made me feel like I had accomplished anything meaningful. I was supporting my family, Margaret and David, and then, when David was 8, we had another child, a daughter named Sophie. Supporting a family felt like its own accomplishment for a while. It gave structure to my days. It gave me an excuse not to think about whether I was happy. But somewhere in my 40s, I started to feel something that I can only describe as a slow-building resentment. Not toward Margaret exactly, though God knows she had suffered enough at my hands. Not toward my children exactly, though I think David particularly sensed that I was never quite present, even when I was in the room. The resentment was toward myself, toward the fact that I had somehow become a man I didn't recognize. A man who went to work, came home, ate dinner, watched television, and went to bed, and did it all again the next day, and never once asked himself if this was all there was supposed to be. Margaret left in 1995. She was patient about it. She gave me plenty of warning, lots of opportunities to change, years of therapy that I resisted every step of the way. I was a decent provider. I never hit her. I showed up for the important events. By the standards of the time, by the standards of her parents and her friends, I was doing fine, but Margaret wanted more than fine. She wanted a partner. She wanted a husband who could talk about his feelings, who could engage with the world around him, who could actually be present in his own life. I couldn't do that then, so she left. David was 25 when his mother and I separated, old enough that it wasn't the tragedy it might have been, old enough that he had his own life, his own relationships, his own reasons to move forward. But it was clear that my failure with Margaret had affected him. He was distant with me in a way he had never quite been before. When Margaret got primary custody, though custody is a strange word when your child is an adult, I lost him too, or I lost the routine of having him. He came to visit on his birthday and on Christmas and occasionally during the summer, but the visits were strained. He was waiting for them to be over. I could sense it. Sophie, who was 18, chose to stay with me initially, which was its own kind of cruelty. She stayed, but she was furious with me for letting her mother leave. She stayed in the house with me, and she made sure I understood how much she resented my presence in her life. We existed in the same space for 2 years while she finished high school and waited for college to start, and in those 2 years, we probably spoke 50 genuine sentences to each other. The rest was resentment, served in silence. By the time she left for college, I was alone in the house that I had worked so hard to buy and maintain, and I realized that all of that work, all of those years of jobs and paychecks and responsibilities had been for something that I had never actually wanted. I had spent my entire adult life building a life that was supposed to make me happy, but never did. I could have changed things then. I was in my mid-40s. I could have traveled or taken classes or pursued some long-buried passion. I could have worked on my relationship with my children. I could have done any number of things, but what I did instead was retreat further into numbness. I stopped trying to reach out to David and Sophie. I accepted that I was the kind of father that children tolerate, not the kind they actually want around. I accepted that I was the kind of man that women leave. I accepted that I was mediocre at everything except work, and my work was uninteresting to me. I built a life of solitude, but I didn't call it that. I called it independence. I didn't acknowledge that I was lonely. I told myself that I simply didn't need people the way other men did. I was self-sufficient. I was content. I was stable. All of these things were lies. But they were lies that I had become very good at believing. The years passed. David got married. I attended the wedding, sat in the back, left early. Sophie became a lawyer. I learned about it secondhand through Margaret because Sophie didn't think to tell me herself. My grandchildren were born, and I met them exactly 3 times in the first 5 years of their lives. Their names were Emma and Lucas, and they were perfect, and I had no relationship with them whatsoever. I wasn't a bad man, exactly. I didn't do anything cruel. I didn't hurt anyone physically. I just didn't show up, not in the ways that mattered. I was reliable in the ways that were easy: birthday cards with checks, phone calls on major holidays, and absent in the ways that were hard: building a real relationship, admitting fault, being vulnerable, letting my children see me as something other than an obligation they had to manage. By 60, I had settled into my life so completely that I couldn't imagine it being any other way. I had a house that was entirely too large for me, with rooms I never entered and a garage filled with tools I no longer used. I had a bank account with a comfortable amount of money in it, not wealthy, but not struggling. I had a pension from years of work. I had a dog, an old golden retriever named Chester, who followed me from room to room, but whom I rarely actually petted or played with. I had a routine, I had safety, and I had nothing that anyone could point to and call love. I kept in minimal contact with my children. I saw David at his father-in-law's funeral, Margaret's current husband's father, and we awkwardly made conversation about his job in finance and his 2 children and the weather in Seattle, where he had moved in the early 2000s. I received holiday cards from Sophie showing pictures of her partner and her adopted daughter, and I sent checks back with brief notes. The tone was cordial but distant, like we were polite acquaintances rather than family. I told myself I was content. I read books. I took the dog on walks. I started working on home improvement projects that I never finished. I volunteered at a local community center, teaching basic computer skills to seniors, a job that was easy enough that I never had to think about it. I went to the movies alone. I ate dinner in front of the television. I had built a life that required nothing from anyone, and I pretended that this was a kind of freedom rather than what it actually was, a kind of death. The heart attack came on a Tuesday in February during my morning walk with Chester. I was 68 years old, and I had convinced myself that I was in good health. I ate reasonably well. I walked every day. I didn't smoke. I had regular checkups, and my doctor said I had the blood pressure of a younger man. But my doctor, Dr. Susan Williams, had also mentioned over the past few years that my weight was creeping up, that I should increase my exercise, that my family history of heart disease was something to monitor carefully. I had nodded during these conversations and then ignored everything she said. The pain hit like nothing I had ever experienced. Not the pain in my chest that I had always imagined a heart attack would feel like. Chest pain is what they mention in the commercials, chest pain and shortness of breath. What I felt was a pain that radiated through my entire body, from my shoulders to my abdomen, like something inside me was tearing apart. I was 2 blocks from my house, wearing a jacket and khakis and the same New Balance sneakers I wore every day, and I couldn't remember where I lived or why I had left my house in the first place. Chester pulled me forward, his leash tight in my hand, and I fell. I remember the feeling of the concrete under my knees and the smell of the rain that had fallen the night before and the sound of Chester barking, which seemed very far away. I remember thinking, this is it. This is the thing that ends. And part of me, a part that I didn't want to acknowledge, felt relieved. The next part is hazy. A woman found me, a young woman with a dog of her own, and she called 911. I was in an ambulance, and there were sirens, and people asking me questions that I couldn't answer. Then I was in a hospital, which smelled like bleach and fear, and there were machines attached to me, and a doctor was telling me that I had had a significant cardiac event, and they would need to do an angiogram to see what damage had been done. I was conscious for enough of this to understand the basic facts. My heart had not been functioning correctly. There had been a blockage. I had gotten lucky that I had been found when I was. Another few minutes, and they would have been planning my funeral instead of my treatment. I had my angiogram, and the results were not good. I had 3 blocked arteries, and one of them was severely restricted. The doctor, a man named Dr. Chen, who was younger than me by at least 2 decades, explained that I had 2 options. The first was to go home on medication and hope for the best. The second was to have bypass surgery, which was major, but which would give me the best chance at a longer and healthier life. He recommended the surgery. He used words like significantly improved survival rates and quality of life and years of additional living. He looked genuinely kind as he said these things, which somehow made it worse. Kindness from a stranger was something I didn't know how to receive. I told him I needed to think about it. What I needed to think about was whether I actually wanted to live. This seems like a melodramatic thing to admit, even now. I was not suicidal in the clinical sense. I wasn't planning to harm myself, but I had spent so many years not actually living that the idea of doing so seemed almost pointless. I had no one who depended on me. My dog could be rehomed. My house could be sold. My money could go to my children, assuming they wanted it. I was not going to be missed in any meaningful way. That's what I was thinking when I called David. He was at work when I called, his office in Seattle, his job in finance, his life that he had built carefully and well, the one that I had never quite understood or been part of. His assistant put me through, and he answered with a slight note of surprise in his voice. I didn't call him often. I had trained both my children not to expect regular contact from me. I told him I had had a heart attack. I gave him the basic facts, clinical and plain. I told him the doctor was recommending surgery. I told him I wasn't sure what I was going to do. There was a pause. Then he said, "You're going to have the surgery, Dad." The way he said Dad was not familiar. It was a word he used, but it didn't sound like it meant anything to him anymore. Still, the fact that he had said it at all, that he had taken time out of his workday to insist that I do something to preserve my life, made something twist inside my chest that had nothing to do with my heart condition. "I don't know," I said. "It's major. The recovery is long, at my age." "You're not that old," he interrupted. "And you're going to have the surgery, and you're going to recover, and you're going to live for another 15 or 20 years. That's what's going to happen." I wanted to ask him why he cared. I wanted to ask him what difference it made to him whether I was alive or dead. But I didn't. Instead, I said, "I'll think about it." He said, "Don't think, do." Then he said, "I'm going to call Sophie and we're going to figure out the recovery situation. You're not going to be alone with this. You're going to have surgery and we're going to help you get through it." "You don't have to," I started, but he had already hung up. I scheduled the surgery for March 15th, which felt like a date that meant something, though I couldn't have said what. I had been in the hospital for 2 weeks before that, undergoing tests and consultations and preoperative procedures. Dr. Chen had explained the surgery to me in detail. They would crack my chest open. He didn't use those words, but that's what it amounted to, and they would take veins from my legs and use them to create new pathways around the blocked arteries. It was the closest thing modern medicine had to offering someone a second chance. The night before the surgery, I couldn't sleep. I lay in a hospital bed, hooked up to machines that monitored my heart rate and blood pressure, and I thought about my life, all 75 years of it. I thought about Margaret and how she had tried to get me to be better and how I had failed her. I thought about David and how he had called me Dad with absolutely no fondness in his voice, but also no anger, just obligation. And I thought about Sophie, whom I barely knew anymore, and what she must think of me if she thought of me at all. I thought about the life I could have had if I had been different. If I had been brave or kind or present, if I had chosen connection over safety, and I wondered if it was too late to change any of that now. Around 3 a.m., a nurse came in to check on me. Her name was Jennifer, and she had been kind to me over the past 2 weeks. She didn't need to be. I was an unremarkable patient, one of many people lying in hospital beds, waiting for procedures that would either save their lives or not. But she had stopped to talk to me sometimes, asking about my life, telling me about hers. She was 30 years old and had 2 small children and a husband who was a teacher. She was tired all the time and loved her job more than she had ever loved anything. "Can't sleep?" she asked, moving around me efficiently, checking the monitors, adjusting something in my IV line. "No," I said. "That's normal," she said. "Most people can't sleep the night before surgery." "Are you going to think I'm crazy?" I said. "If I tell you I'm not sure I want to wake up?" She didn't look shocked or concerned in a way that suggested she thought I needed to be put on suicide watch. Instead, she pulled a chair over and sat down beside the bed. "No," she said, "I don't think you're crazy, but I think you're scared, and sometimes fear can feel like not wanting something when what you're really not wanting is the uncertainty." "I've lived 75 years, I said, "and I have nothing to show for it. No one would miss me if I died tomorrow." "That's not true," she said firmly. "I know at least 2 people who would miss you, and neither of them is me." "Who?" I asked, though I thought I knew. "Your son called the nurses' station yesterday 3 times, asking how you were doing. Your daughter came by this morning before you woke up, and she just sat in that chair looking at you." She gestured to the corner of the room, and I realized I had no memory of Sophie being there. She didn't want to wake you, but she wanted to be here. Those are people who would miss you, Mr. Pattinson. Those are people who care. I didn't know what to say to that. So I said nothing, and Jennifer sat with me for a while in the quiet, and then she left, and I lay there in the dark, thinking about my daughter sitting in that chair, watching me sleep. They came to get me at 6 a.m. The pre-op nurses, efficient and cheerful, preparing me for surgery. I hadn't eaten since midnight. I had been given medication to help me relax, and I felt floaty, disconnected from my body. They moved me from my hospital bed to a gurney, and they wheeled me down hallways that were bright and sterile and smelled like metal and fear. David was waiting outside the surgical suite with his family. His wife Jennifer was there, a different Jennifer than the nurse, and his two children, Emma and Lucas, who were now teenagers and who I barely recognized. Sophie was there too, wearing scrubs, which I had forgotten she did sometimes when she came to visit. She was an emergency room lawyer, which meant she helped people navigate hospital bureaucracy and medical law. She had probably taken time off work to be here. "Hey, Dad," David said, and I heard the word Dad differently now. I heard it as someone who had made a decision to try, and I didn't know what I had done to deserve that. I wanted to say something meaningful. I wanted to say that I was sorry and that I loved them and that I had wasted time that I could never get back. But the pre-op medication was making me feel distant, and there was no time for meaningful conversation. They were moving me toward the surgical suite, and I could see the doors that led into the operating room. "I love you," David said, and Sophie said it too, and I was wheeled away before I could say it back. The operating room was colder than I expected, and there were more people than I expected. A surgical team of at least 8 or 9 people, all dressed in blue, all focused on preparing the space and the equipment for what was about to happen. They moved me from the gurney to the operating table, and there were straps, and there were explanations, and then Dr. Chen was there, and he was talking to me about how he was going to take good care of you, and someone was putting a mask on my face, and they were telling me to count backwards from 10. I got to 7 before everything went black. There are stories about near-death experiences. People talk about white light and tunnel vision and a sense of peace. They talk about seeing loved ones, or about reviewing their lives, or about feeling like they're falling upward into something infinite and strange. I expected something like that. What I experienced instead was consciousness without context. I was aware, but I was not in my body. I could hear sounds, voices, machinery, the sounds of a hospital operating room in crisis, but I couldn't move toward them or make them make sense. I could feel emotion, but it was distant, like something happening in another room. I could almost think, but my thoughts were scattered, disconnected, like trying to have a conversation while underwater. I don't know how long I was in this state. Time doesn't work the same way when you're not fully conscious. It could have been minutes or hours, but there was a moment. I remember this with perfect clarity when I heard David's voice, not in the operating room, somewhere else, somewhere I wasn't. He was saying, "He's got a pulse, keep going, come on, Dad, come on." And then, as if he knew I could hear him, he said, "You're going to get through this. I need you to get through this. I have so much I want to tell you, and I can't tell you if you're dead." The desperation in his voice was something that cut through the fog. This was my son, the man I had failed to be present for, and he was begging me to stay alive. Not because he needed me to take care of him, not because he owed me anything, but because he wanted me there. He wanted me in his life. That's when I felt it, a pull, like a rope around my waist, drawing me back toward something, toward consciousness, toward my body, toward the machines that were keeping me alive, toward the possibility that I could still matter to someone. The next thing I remember clearly is waking up. They told me later that I had coded on the table during surgery. My heart had stopped, and it had taken 4 minutes and 38 seconds to get it beating again. Dr. Chen had walked into the waiting room with blood on his gloves. He hadn't taken the time to change them, and had told my son that I had had a complication, but they had managed to revive me, and we were going to proceed with caution. They had asked David if they should continue with the surgery or if he wanted them to close me back up and get me to recovery. David had said to continue. That decision, The decision to keep me alive, to let them finish the surgery, to bet on the possibility that I might be worth saving. That was the most important decision of my life, and someone else made it for me. I woke up in the ICU, intubated, unable to speak, unable to move very much. The pain was extraordinary, not the pain I had expected, the chest pain that would come from having my ribs cracked open. That pain was there, yes, but it was nothing compared to the pain of my legs, where they had harvested veins, where I was cut and stitched and healing in ways that made me want to scream. But I couldn't scream. I could only lie there, and I could only see the ceiling, and I could only wait while people I couldn't fully see or hear moved around me, taking blood, adjusting machines, checking monitors, documenting the progress of a man who had died and been brought back. David was there. I remember him sitting in a chair next to my bed, and I remember him talking to me even though I couldn't respond. He told me about work, and about his kids, and about his wife. He told me about going to see a movie the week before. He told me everything, like if he just filled the silence with enough words, it would keep me alive. "Sophie's been here every day," he said at one point. "She's been sleeping in the waiting room. Your nurse Jennifer is letting her use the break room, but Sophie insists on staying close, just in case you need something. She's been a lawyer for the hospital for 3 years now, and she still doesn't know everything about this place, but she's learned. She's learned for you." I wanted to tell him I was sorry. I wanted to tell him everything I had been thinking about the night before surgery, all the regrets that were suddenly crystal clear to me now that someone had quite literally yanked me back from death. But I couldn't talk, so I cried instead. I lay there in a hospital bed, intubated, with tubes coming out of my body in at least 6 different places, and I cried like I hadn't cried since I was a child. David took my hand, carefully, because I was connected to so many machines, and he said, "It's okay. You're okay. You're going to be okay." I don't know if he was telling the truth, but I appreciated it anyway. I was in the ICU for 5 days. On the second day, they removed the breathing tube, and I could finally talk, though talking hurt because my throat was raw and my chest felt like it had been through a war, which it had. My body had literally had a war fought in it. Sophie came in that afternoon, and she pulled a chair close to my bed, and she didn't say anything at first. She just looked at me, and I looked at her, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was actually seeing her. She was a beautiful woman. I had missed that while I was busy not being present in her life. She had my eyes, but her mother's face, and something of herself that was entirely her own. She was in her early 50s now, and I had no idea what that meant for her. I didn't know what made her happy or sad or angry. I didn't know her at all. "Hi," she said finally. "Hi," I managed, my voice a whisper. "You nearly died," she said, and there was anger in her voice mixed with something else. Relief maybe, or love. "You nearly died, and I haven't spoken to you in person in 5 years. The last real conversation we had was when I told you I was getting divorced, and you told me you were sorry, and then you said something about the property settlement that made me think you were more concerned about whether your taxes were going to be affected than whether I was okay." I didn't remember that conversation, but I believed her. That sounded exactly like something I would have done. "I'm sorry," I said. "I know," she said, "but I'm not sure that's enough anymore." "It's not," I agreed. "It's not going to be enough, but it's all I can offer right now." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Do you want to know why I was here? When you coded, I was sitting in the waiting room and I watched David's face change. He wasn't scared, he was terrified. I've never seen my brother look like that. And I realized that I had spent 50 years of my life knowing that I had a father, and I had chosen to not really know you, and I was angry about that, but I was also angry at myself for not trying harder to change it. So I'm trying now." "Why?" I asked. "Because you're still alive," she said, "and because you're still my father, whether you've acted like it or not, and because maybe it's not too late to be different. Maybe it's not too late." The words became like a mantra for me over the next several months. I was moved out of the ICU after 5 days, moved to a regular cardiac ward. My pain was managed better now with medication, and I was able to walk with help, though walking was agony. I had to relearn how to move my body, which had been cracked open and repaired. My legs felt like someone had taken them apart and put them back together incorrectly. My chest felt like it might cave in if I breathed too deeply. But I could walk, and every day I walked a little bit further. They gave me a goal: go down the hallway to the nurse's station and back, then make it to the end of the floor, then walk the perimeter of the ward. It was the most basic physical rehabilitation, but it felt like the most important thing I had ever done. David visited every day. He would sit with me or walk with me, and he would talk. He told me things about his life. He told me that he had been promoted to a senior position at his firm and that he had wanted to tell me, but he had never thought I would care. He told me that his son Lucas had decided to study engineering and his daughter Emma wanted to be an artist, and he was letting both of them pursue these things even though he had thought they should do something more practical. He was letting them choose their own paths, he said, which was something no one had let him do. "You could have chosen your own path," I said, during one of these conversations. "No," he said, "I couldn't. I had to be the responsible one. I had to be the one who didn't need anything from you, because I learned early on that asking for things was pointless. So I became a person who didn't ask, and that became who I am." The guilt that accompanied this realization was almost as painful as the surgery. More painful, actually, because surgery was temporary and healing was happening, but the guilt was something I wasn't sure I could ever recover from. "I'm sorry," I said, which felt like the least helpful thing I could possibly say. "I know," David said, "but what I need now is not an apology. I need you to be different. I need you to actually be my father now in a way that you haven't been. And I know that's asking a lot, but I'm asking anyway." I said I would try, and I meant it, but I also knew that trying was something I had not been very good at. Trying required vulnerability and patience and the willingness to fail in front of someone you cared about. Trying required doing the hard work instead of just accepting the easier path of distance. But I was 75 years old, and I had just been brought back from the dead. If that wasn't time to try, I wasn't sure when would be. Sophie visited me every day too, sometimes with David, sometimes alone. She brought me books and flowers and terrible hospital coffee that she insisted was better than the coffee they served in the hospital cafeteria. She told me about her work as a lawyer, about the cases she had worked on, about the woman she had been with for 4 years named Marie, who worked in hospital administration. "I know you might not be happy about me being gay," Sophie said to me one afternoon, very matter-of-factly, as if this was just another thing that needed to be established between us. "I'm not unhappy about it," I said carefully. "That's not the same as being happy about it," she pointed out. "No," I agreed, "it's not, but I'm working on it. I'm working on being happy about things in your life, because your life is what matters, and I was wrong to act like it didn't." "You never acted like it didn't matter," Sophie said. "You just weren't there to see it, so it was like it didn't matter to you, which is worse in some ways." She wasn't wrong. Sophie brought Marie to visit me after I had been in the hospital for about 2 weeks. Marie was exactly what I would have wanted for my daughter if I had been a person who had wanted things for my daughter: kind, intelligent, ambitious, devoted. She brought me a plant, which seemed to amuse her somehow, and she stayed for a short visit, and then she left Sophie and me alone. "She's great," I said after she left. "Yeah," Sophie said, "she is, and I'd like to think that you could get to know her better if you want to." "I'd like that," I said, and I meant it. I meant it with a desperation that surprised me, because getting to know Marie and getting to know the woman my daughter had become, and being present for whatever came next, that all seemed like the most important work I had ever been asked to do. I was released from the hospital after 3 weeks. The pain was still significant, and I would need physical therapy, and I would need to take medication for the rest of my life, and there were restrictions on what I could and couldn't do. But I was alive, and I was going home, and I was terrified. David came to pick me up. He packed my bag and helped me into his car, and he drove me to the house that had been empty for so long, and he helped me inside. The house felt different now. It had always been empty, but now I was aware of that emptiness in a way I hadn't been before. Chester, who had been staying with Sophie since I had been hospitalized, came bounding in, and he was so happy to see me that I nearly fell over. I sat down in my favorite chair, and my old dog put his head on my knee, and David sat on the couch across from me, and we didn't say anything for a long time. "What happens now?" I finally asked. "Now you heal," David said, "and you go to physical therapy, and you quit your job because Dr. Chen was very clear that you need to reduce your stress." "I like my job," I said. "I know," David said, "but you like your life more, and if you keep working, you're not going to have a life to live." He was right, and it was strange. He was my son, and yet he was talking to me like he was the adult and I was the child. Like he was the one who had to make the reasonable decisions about what was best for me, which I suppose he did, because I had spent so long not knowing how to do that for myself. "I'll quit," I said. The next several months were about rebuilding. Physical therapy was agonizing, but it was also somehow clarifying. Every day, I had to do the hard work of getting my body to function in the way it was supposed to. Every day, I had to push through pain and exhaustion to move a little bit further. And every day, I learned something about resilience and patience and the fact that progress doesn't happen all at once. It happens in small increments, and it requires showing up even when you don't want to. David helped me with some of the physical therapy at first. He would come by my house, and he would help me do the prescribed exercises, and he would sit with me while I did my walks around the neighborhood. On one of these walks, he told me about his childhood. "You don't know this," he said, "but I used to pretend you were dead. I know that sounds dramatic, but I'm serious. I was maybe 12, and I realized that you were never going to be the kind of father that other kids had. The kind that played catch with you, or came to your games, or seemed proud of you. And that was really painful, so I just decided that you were dead. It was easier to think of you as not there at all than to think of you as being there and just not caring." We were walking very slowly, me with the posture of someone who was still healing, David matching my pace. "I'm so sorry," I said, and the words felt inadequate, but they were all I had. "I know you are," he said, "and I don't need you to apologize. I just need you to understand what it was like for me, what it was like to have a father who was there physically but not emotionally. And I need you to know that I'm not the same person I was then. I'm different because of that, and some of the ways I'm different are good, and some of them are not so good, but they're all because of you." It was a lot to sit with. It was a lot to acknowledge that my absence had shaped my son in ways that I was only now beginning to understand. It was a lot to realize that by trying to protect myself from pain through numbness, I had caused pain to someone else. But I sat with it, and David helped me sit with it by continuing to show up and continuing to be present and continuing to offer me the chance to be a different father now than I had been before. Sophie came by too, several times a week. She would bring Marie or bring food or just come by herself and sit with me while I did my exercises. She told me about cases she was working on, about the hospital politics, about Marie's family, and how she was getting to know them. She asked me questions about my life, my childhood, my family. And for the first time in years, I tried to answer them honestly instead of giving the kind of vague, dismissive answers I had perfected over decades. I told her about my father, who had been a hard man and a distant man, and who had never once told me he loved me. I told her that I had thought I was breaking a cycle by not drinking or cheating or doing the more dramatic forms of damage that men in my family had done. But I realized that I had just created a different kind of damage. I had just been quiet about it. "So you learned how to hurt people quietly," Sophie said, and it wasn't a question. "Yes," I said. "And now you're trying to unlearn that." "Yes," I said. "Is it too late?" Sophie considered this. "I don't know," she said, "but I don't think it matters. What matters is that you're trying. What matters is that you're here and you're trying." 4 months after surgery, I was cleared to live a normal life. I still had restrictions. I couldn't do heavy lifting, and I had to be careful about exertion, and I had to take my medication every day. But I could work theoretically, though I had already decided not to return to my old job. The idea of going back to that community center, teaching computer skills to people I didn't care about, in a job that had never meant anything to me, it suddenly seemed pointless. I had been given a second chance, and I was not going to spend it doing things that didn't matter. So I did something different. I called David's office, and I asked if they were looking for anyone to do data entry or administrative work. He was confused at first. The idea of his father asking him for a job was so foreign that it took him a moment to understand what I was saying. "You want to work with me," he said. "I want to be around you," I said, "and I don't think I'm going to get another chance at that if I don't take this one." He hired me. He gave me a part-time job in the administrative department of his firm, filing documents and managing the filing system and doing basic data entry. It was work that required minimal physical strain, and it meant that I came into his office 3 days a week, and I had lunch with him, and I met some of the people he worked with, and I became a real, physical presence in his life. It was strange at first. I felt like an outsider, and like people were uncertain about what to do with an elderly man who was the boss's father and who seemed to know very little about how the office worked. But gradually, people got used to me. A few of the older administrative staff took pity on me and showed me shortcuts. The younger people were fascinated by the fact that I was learning computers as someone who had grown up before they existed. On my 3rd week of work, David asked me if I wanted to have dinner with his family. His full family, his wife, his children, his in-laws, everyone. He was throwing a summer party, and he wanted me there, and he wanted everyone to know that I was his father. I was terrified. I had met his children before, but I barely knew them. I had never met his wife's parents. I didn't know how to be around family, especially not family that was full of young people who had their entire lives ahead of them. But I said yes. The party was in their backyard in Seattle. It was a Saturday in July, and the weather was perfect, and the garden was beautiful, and there were about 30 people there. David met me at the door and introduced me around, and he didn't let me hide. He presented me as his father with a note of pride in his voice, and then he introduced me to each person individually. His wife Sarah was warm to me in a way that David must have asked her to be. His children were polite, though still somewhat distant. His in-laws were curious, and there were a lot of questions about my health and the surgery and how I was recovering. But the moment that changed things was when David's son Lucas came to sit with me while I was eating a burger on the patio. "Dad told me you almost died," he said. He was 17, with his father's serious expression and his mother's dark eyes. "I did," I said, "for a few minutes." "And you came back," he said. "Someone pulled me back," I said. "Your father mostly." "He talks about you a lot," Lucas said. "Since the surgery. Before that, he didn't talk about you very much at all, but now he does. He tells me stories about when he was a kid and you were never there and how that shaped him. He says it's made him a better father because he knew what it felt like to not have one." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing, and Lucas seemed to understand that silence was the right response. "I'm glad you lived," he said finally. "Emma's glad too. She was really scared." Emma, his sister, waved from across the yard. She was 19, and she was studying painting, and I realized I had never actually spoken to her for more than 30 seconds. "Come walk with me," I said to her after Lucas left. She came a little warily, and we walked around the perimeter of the garden. I asked her about her art, and she told me about the pieces she was working on, and the teachers she had, and the art school she was considering for next year. She was talented. I could see that even though I knew nothing about art, but more than that, she was thoughtful. She cared about what she was doing. "What made you want to be an artist?" I asked. "My dad," she said. "He always told me to do what I loved, even if it didn't make sense. He said that life is too short to spend it on things that don't matter to you. I think he meant it differently when I was younger, but I got older and realized what he actually meant." We sat on a bench overlooking the garden, and I asked her if she wanted to know why her father was the way he was. And I told her about my own father and about being unavailable and about how I had spent decades making my children understand that wanting things from me was pointless. "He's not like that now," Emma said. "With us, he's different." "I think becoming a parent showed him what he didn't have," I said, "and he decided not to repeat my mistakes." "Did you decide that?" she asked. "I'm deciding it now," I said, very late in the game, but I'm deciding it." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "That's something, I guess." And it was. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was a beginning. Over the next year, my life changed in ways that I couldn't have predicted. I became a regular part of David's office. I became someone his children actually knew, and then someone they actually liked. I had a standing invitation to family dinners. David would call me sometimes just to talk about his day, and I would call him back. Sophie brought Marie to visit more often, and eventually they asked if I would come to their wedding, which was held at the courthouse in Portland, with a small group of people afterward at a local restaurant. I gave a speech. I stood up in front of maybe 20 people and talked about my daughter and how I had missed so much of her life, and how I was grateful that she was giving me the chance to be present for the parts that came next. I didn't cry, but I came close. I also reconnected with my brother Michael. He had moved to Boston with his second wife, and we hadn't spoken in 11 years. I called him one day. I don't remember what made me decide to do it, and I told him about the surgery and about my epiphany and about how I was trying to be different. He was guarded at first. We had never been close, and I had been just as distant with him as I had been with my children. But I explained that I was trying to repair relationships that I had damaged through my absence, and that I would like to try with him if he was willing. We started talking on the phone once a week. He told me about his life, and I told him about mine. It was awkward sometimes because we were essentially rebuilding a relationship from scratch. But he had children too, and grandchildren, and over time, he introduced them to me. We are not close in the way that families can be close, but we are connected now, and that is more than we had been. A year and a half after the surgery, I did something I had been thinking about for months. I sold my house. It was too big for me, and it held no good memories. I had bought it because I felt like I was supposed to own a house, not because I actually wanted to. When I sold it, it felt like releasing something that I had been holding too tightly. With the money, I bought a smaller place in Seattle, near David's neighborhood, close enough that I could see him regularly, but far enough that I maintained my independence. The house had a small garden, which I started to cultivate. I learned about flowers and plants, which was something Margaret had loved that I had never shared with her. It was a strange way to feel close to someone who was no longer in my life, but it worked. I also took some classes. I took a creative writing class at a local community college, which is where I started writing down these memories. I took a class on art history with Emma, which was both beautiful and painful. Beautiful because I got to see how she thought, and painful because I realized how much time I had lost with her that I could never get back. Dr. Chen, my surgeon, released me for light exercise after 2 years, so I started going to a gym, very carefully, doing weight training that would strengthen my heart without stressing it. I met an older man there named Harold, who was also recovering from a cardiac event, and we became friends. We would work out together, and then we would go for coffee, and he would tell me about his life, and I would tell him about mine. "You're lucky," he told me once. "Why?" I asked. "Because your family came back," he said. "My children haven't spoken to me in 15 years. I'm not sure they would even come to my funeral. You got a second chance with yours." I didn't have a good response to that. He was right. I was lucky, and I had nearly wasted that luck by not being willing to do the hard work of rebuilding. "It's not too late for you," I said. "You could reach out." "I'm 78, he said. "I don't have time for slow rebuilding." "Neither did I said. "I'm 76 and I was dead for 4 minutes. You're always in time." I don't know if he ever reached out to his children. We lost touch after a few months. His schedule changed, and I became busier with family things. But I think about him sometimes, and I hope that he did. 2 years after my surgery, David and Sarah renewed their vows. I don't know if they did it for me specifically, but I suspected they did. They had been married for over 20 years, and I had been absent for most of that time. But now I was there, and they invited everyone, and it was clear that my presence mattered to them. I walked Sarah down the aisle with David, both of them holding an arm. At one point, David turned to me and said, "Thank you for being here." "There's nowhere else I would be," I said. And I meant it with every part of my being. The ceremony was beautiful, and the reception was joyful, and I danced with Sophie, and I spoke with all of David's friends and colleagues, and I felt like I was part of something real for the first time in my life. At the end of the night, Emma showed me something. She had painted a portrait of me for the wedding, nothing fancy, just a portrait of an old man, but it was me. It was unmistakably me. And the way she had captured my eyes, there was something hopeful in them that I wasn't sure was actually there, but that I wanted to believe was there. I painted this 6 months ago, she said, and I wasn't even sure I was going to show you, but then I thought, what's the worst thing that happens if I give it to him? He doesn't like it. He already knows I'm not great at making my family happy anyway. It's beautiful, I said, and I was crying, which seemed to be my new constant state whenever I was moved by something. You look hopeful in it, she said. Is that accurate? I considered the question. Was I hopeful? 6 months ago, I would have said no. 2 years ago, before the surgery, the answer would have been definitely no. But now? Yes, I said, I think that's accurate. 3 years after the surgery, Chester died. He was old, he had been old before my surgery, and his health had been declining. I had spent a lot of time with him during my recovery, and in some ways, he had been as much a part of my healing as anything else. A dog who asked nothing of you except food and affection, and who gave those same things back without judgment. David came with me to the vet, and we sat with Chester in his final minutes. I held his head, and I told him about all the walks we had taken, and all the years he had been my only companion. And I told him that I was sorry that I had taken him for granted, that I had had a dog who loved me unconditionally, and I had rarely actually petted him or played with him or shown him the kind of affection he deserved. But I told him I was grateful. Grateful for his presence, grateful for the unconditional love, grateful for the years that he had quietly stood by me while I learned how to be a different kind of person. David put his arm around me while I grieved, and I realized that this was what family was supposed to feel like. Not something that you tolerated out of obligation, but something that you stood in together through the hard moments. 4 years after the surgery, Sophie and Marie had a child. They used a surrogate, and the baby, a son named James, was born in the spring. I was there in the hospital waiting room while Marie was with the surrogate during labor, and I was there when they brought the baby to meet his parents. I held him in my arms, this tiny person who was my great-nephew, the grandson of my daughter, a new generation that wouldn't exist if my surgery hadn't worked out. He's perfect, I said. He is, Sophie said, and she was crying, and Marie was crying, and I was crying, and David was there too, and he was holding his niece-to-be. They were planning to have another child in a few years, and we were all just crying together. Do you want him to call you? Sophie asked. And I had to sit with that for a moment, because I had never been a grandfather in any meaningful way. I had been someone who existed in the background of my grandchildren's lives, a person who sent cards and money, but was not otherwise present. I would like that, I said, if you want him to, but I don't expect it to come naturally. I'll have to learn how to be a grandfather, just like I had to learn how to be a father. We'll teach you, Sophie said. And they did. Over the following years, I learned how to be the kind of grandfather that James needed. I learned how to hold an infant and rock him to sleep. I learned how to read picture books with enthusiasm. I learned how to play with a toddler and how to understand what he wanted even when he couldn't articulate it. I learned patience in a way I had never learned it before, because a child demands patience in a way that an adult never does. Emma had a studio in Seattle now, and she was becoming known for her work. Her paintings often featured people, faces mostly, captured in moments of emotion or introspection. She painted me again 5 years after the surgery, and this time the portrait was different. The hopefulness was still there. But so was something else, acceptance maybe, or peace. Lucas was studying engineering at the University of Washington, and he would sometimes come help me with projects around the house. He was a good teacher, patient in a way that his father had learned how to be. He would explain things to me slowly and carefully, and he seemed to enjoy sharing his knowledge. David and I worked together at his office for 5 years. When I was 80, I officially retired, but not from life. I had learned the difference between retiring from work and retiring from living, and I had no intention of doing the latter. 5 years after the surgery, I did something that I had been thinking about for a long time. I found my father's grave. My father had died when I was 37 years old. I had not gone to his funeral. I was in the midst of my career, and I was busy, and my father had been a cold man, and I had convinced myself that there was no point in paying respects to someone who had never respected me. But I had carried the damage he had done for my entire life, and I had, in turn, done damage to my own children, and I wanted to break that cycle in whatever way I could. I found his grave in Portland, in a cemetery that I had never been to. It was a simple headstone with his name and the dates of his birth and death, nothing else. No epitaph, no loving tribute, just the basic facts. I stood there for a long time, and I didn't cry. I didn't feel the anger that I had expected to feel. What I felt was sadness. Sadness for the man who had been my father, who had not known how to be close to anyone. Sadness for the ways that his damage had affected me and the ways that my damage had affected my children. Sadness for all the years that had been lost to fear and numbness. But I also felt something like forgiveness. Not forgiveness of him, I'm not sure I'm capable of that, even now. But forgiveness of myself, maybe, for the fact that I had done the best I could with what I had been given, and I was trying to be better now, and that had to be enough. I told him out loud, to a dead man in a cemetery, that I was sorry for being his son. I was sorry that he had been in pain, and sorry that he hadn't known how to reach out, and sorry that his pattern of distance had been passed down to me. And then I said, but it stops here. The pattern stops with me. My children know that I love them. My grandchildren will know that I love them. Whatever you couldn't give me, I'm going to make sure they know they have it. A woman walking by looked at me like I was crazy, which I probably was, at least a little bit. But I didn't care. Sometimes you have to talk to the dead to make peace with yourself. 6 years after the surgery, Dr. Chen retired. Before he left his practice, he asked me to come see him one last time. I went to his office, and he had his staff take a picture of the two of us together. He was kind and warm and professional, the same way he had been in the ICU when he was telling me that my heart had stopped, but that he had brought me back. You've done well, he said. Most people in your position, people who have a cardiac event and are given a second chance, they don't do what you did. They don't change their lives. They go back to their old patterns. I had good reasons to change, I said. You did, he agreed. Your family. My son came back, I said, even though I had spent decades pushing him away. He came back, and he insisted that I live. I was ready to give up, and he wouldn't let me. That's love, Dr. Chen said. That's what people do when they love you. I'm only just learning about that, I said. You're learning, he said. That's what matters. I'm 80 now. My health has been good. I haven't had another cardiac event, and the doctors say my repaired heart is stronger than it has any right to be. I take my medication every day without fail. I exercise regularly. I eat a diet that would have seemed unimaginable to my younger self, but which has become normal now. More importantly, I have a life. I have people who care about me, and I care about them. I have David, who is my son and my friend. I have Sophie, who is my daughter, and who I am slowly getting to know as a full person, not just as the child I failed to be present for. I have Emma, who paints my portrait sometimes, and Lucas, who teaches me things about the world that I never knew. I have James, my great-nephew and the light of my later years, who calls me grandpa and who follows me around my house, asking questions about everything. I have a garden that I tend carefully, growing the same flowers that Margaret loved. I have a community writing group where I have become known as the old man who writes emotional stories about family. I have friends, real friends, people who know me and like me, and who I know and like in return. But most importantly, I have second chances. So many of them that I still don't fully understand how I have managed to accumulate so many. I am haunted by the years I lost. I think about the time I spent being numb and the time I could have been close to my children. I think about David's childhood and how he created an entire defense mechanism to protect himself from my indifference. I think about Sophie and the years that she lived as someone whose father was too busy to see her. I think about Emma and Lucas, who might have known their grandfather if I had been willing to do the work of being one. But I have learned that regret, like anger, is a useless emotion. It doesn't change the past, it only poisons the present. What I try to do instead is be present now, be the grandfather that James needs, be the father that David and Sophie deserve, even if that father is limited by time and age and the mistakes of the past. Be the person who learned, very late, what it actually means to live. There's a moment that I think about often. It's from the hospital during the surgery. David is not actually in the operating room, so I can't really know what he said or did there. But the nurses told me later that he was there and that he was fighting for me even after my heart stopped, even when it would have been reasonable to give up. I think about David, my son, who I had been distant from for almost his entire life, holding onto the idea of me, not the man I had been, not the father I had actually been, but the man I could become, the father I could be if I was willing to try. When I was in that undefined state between consciousness and death, I felt that love. I felt the rope that David threw out and that pulled me back. I felt his refusal to let me go. So I came back, not for myself, because I had mostly given up on myself, but for him, for the possibility that I could be something other than what I had been. And it turns out that being willing to come back for someone else is the first step in learning how to actually live. I'm writing this because I want you to know that it's not too late. Whatever you have failed at, whatever distance you have created, whatever damage you have done through your presence or your absence, it's not too late to try to fix it. There will be people in your life who are willing to love you despite your failures, despite the ways you have disappointed them. But you have to be willing to come back. You have to be willing to stop being numb and start being present. You have to be willing to try. I nearly died, and I'm grateful that I did, in a strange way, because it was the thing that finally made me understand what I had been missing. You don't need to have a heart attack to learn the same lesson. You can learn it today. You can start showing up for the people who matter. You can start doing the work of actually being alive. It's what I should have done 75 years ago, but I'm doing it now, and it's not too late, and I'm grateful for every day that I get to keep trying. That's what I want you to know. That's what I'm telling myself every morning when I wake up. It's not too late. It's never too late. You always have another chance if you're willing to take it.